Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're going to be breaking down the draft classes for the NFC South. But before we get into the actual draft class breakdowns, first I'm going to go ahead and ask you to like, comment, and subscribe. It would really help out the channel if you did. And now with the intro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's let's get started with the Atlanta Falcons. Going really quickly here through the grades, I will take some time after I go through each grade to go back and talk about some of the more interesting grades and stuff like that. With the 8th overall pick, you guys selected Michael Penix Jr., a quarterback out of Washington. I gave you a C+ for that pick. Your second round pick, 35th overall, was Rook or Horhoro, an interior defensive lineman out of Clemson. I gave you a C grade for that pick. 74th overall, you selected Braylon Trice, an edge rusher out of Washington, and I gave you a A grade for that selection. And your 4th round pick, 109th overall, you took Brandon Dorless, an interior defensive lineman / edge rusher out of Oregon, and I gave that an A grade. With your 5th round selection, 143rd overall, you took J.D. Bertrand, an off-ball linebacker out of Notre Dame, and I gave you a C for that selection. With your first of two 6th round selections, actually back-to-back picks here, you took Jace McClellan, a running back out of Alabama, and a wide receiver out of Illinois named Casey Washington. I gave you a B- and a B grade for those two selections. And then your final pick, 197th overall, was Zion Logue, an interior defensive lineman out of Georgia. So those are the grades for the pick here. But moving back to some of the more interesting selections here, obviously Michael Penix Jr. was the shock of the first round. And I'm being honest with you, I would not have taken Michael Penix Jr. at 8. Less because he's a quarterback and more because he was in fact my 6th highest graded quarterback and he was the 4th one off the board. That being said, I had a top 40 grade on him, so I did have a quote unquote like first round ish sort of grade on him. However, I probably wouldn't have gone quarterback, but I probably also wouldn't have gone edge rusher either. I probably would have taken Rome Odunze. But in a vacuum, I don't think the pick is as outrageous as perhaps the initial reaction to it was, because Kirk Cousins is somebody that the past few years has gotten kind of hurt quite a bit. So you're going to need a backup quarterback that can actually come in and play at a high level. I also understand that Michael Penix Jr. is probably going to sit for, I would say, at least 3 years. So grading this pick really at all is kind of hard to do, because it's the same thing with the Jordan Love pick. Everybody gave that like an F at the time, and now it's an A+ because Jordan Love is arguably a top 10 quarterback in all of football. So obviously if Michael Penix Jr. ends up being that kind of player, then it doesn't really matter that you took him when you had another quarterback that you just gave like $150 million fully guaranteed to. So I don't necessarily disagree with the philosophy behind the pick, but if I was going to take a quarterback to sit for 3 years behind a proven Pro Bowl caliber veteran quarterback, it probably would have been either J.J. McCarthy or Spenser Rattler. And I know Spenser Rattler went in the 5th round. We'll talk about him when we get to the Saints. But I had him graded way higher than that. In fact, I had him graded higher than Michael Penix Jr. But that's a conversation for later on in this video. Needless to say, even though I did think Michael Penix was a first round-ish sort of talent, the grade is still a C+ for me. For those unaware at this point, this is the 5th video in the series, but you're probably just watching it because your team is here. A pick at value, like if I had a 6th round grade on a player like Casey Washington, which I did have a 6th round grade on, I give that grade a B. So a C plus means that you're moving down 2 grades, so to speak. So you go from B to B minus to C plus, and that's because it was a 2 round, quote unquote. It's really tier, but sometimes I say round. It's a 2 tier reach, being that I had a top 40 grade on him and you took him inside the top 10. That means that you reached 2 tiers in order to get him, because there's a top 20 tier and then a top 10 tier. So that's -2 sort of tiers and -2 on the grading system as well. Rook or Hororo, the interior defensive lineman out of Clemson, I give that grade a C. 35th overall, a little bit early for my tastes. I do like him. I think he has a role as a penetrating 3 technique in the next level, or potentially as a guy who starts off on the edge and then kicks inside on passing downs. But the overall draft and who you took after him makes me think that's likely not going to be his role, and he's probably going to be a full-time interior player as probably like a 3 technique. I don't necessarily like him in that role. But I did have a top 100 grade on the player, but that was assuming the role that he was going to play, the role that I wanted him to play. So it is still a significant reach, because you're going from top 100 to top 75 to top 50 to top 40 where you actually took him. So the grade is a C, even though I do think he's going to give you production as an interior pass rusher right away. I just think that there were way better options. If you wanted a 3 technique, there were still a lot of better options, in my opinion. And also, if that isn't his role, you took a player that I had graded higher than him to play that role with 2 picks later in the 4th round in Brandon Dorlus. I had a top 75 grade on Brandon Dorlus, and I have him graded as an edge rusher in my system, but I've got him listed as an interior defensive lineman because I think he's probably someone in that multiple defense that Raheem Morris is going to bring to Atlanta here that is likely to start off on the edge and base and then kick inside during pass rushing downs or obvious passing situations. A little bit of a tweener like that. He's not someone like Braylon Trice, who's really just more of a power guy on the edge, who I do really like. I had a top 50 grade on him. That's why the grade is an A. However, if Dorlus is going to do that base edge rusher switch to interior on pass rushing role, I don't really know what Orhoro's fit in the scheme is going to be. Maybe Orhoro is going to do that, and then Dorlus is just going to be an edge rusher. I could see that happening. I don't think that's an unreasonable idea, but I think the opposite is likely to happen, where they're probably just going to move Rook inside and just keep him there as an interior player, and Dorlus is going to be the versatile piece along that defensive line. It's almost like you took 2 players to play the same position when you already had somebody on your roster that already does that role in David Onyemata. So I don't really know what the philosophy here is, and because of that, there's a lot more uncertainty in the grades of some of these, because I don't really know what they're planning to do. If you want to know what I think about the draft class overall, you can go ahead and skip to the end of the video, or you can watch your in-division rivals here, and then the best picks portion before we end up getting to the overall grades portion of this video. The Carolina Panthers are up next here, and you guys traded up 1 spot to get that 5th-year option here. So with your first round selection, 32nd overall, you selected Xaiver Legette, a Z wide receiver out of South Carolina. And this is a tad bit of a reach for me. I had a top 50 grade on Xaiver Legette. You took him inside of the top 40, so the grade's a B-. Jonathan Brooks was your second selection, 46th overall, another top 50 grade for me. However, this pick is a pick at value, so the grade is a B. Your third round selection, 73rd overall, is Trevin Wallace, an off-ball linebacker out of Kentucky. Not a big fan of that selection. I had a 6th round grade on him, took him inside the top 75, grade is a C. Jadavian Sanders, a tight end out of Texas. This was my tight end too. I had another top 50 grade on him. You've taken 3 players that I had top 50 grades on. But this one you got at 101, which is one of the biggest steals of the entire draft. This is an A-plus pick, and it also fills a very, very big need for this team. This team needs weapons, and more so than that, they need reliable players over the middle for Bryce Young, and Jadavian Sanders is going to do just that. Chow Smith Wade, a slot defensive back out of Washington State University, was your 5th round selection, 146th overall. I think he has special teams upside, may or may not be a factor on defense year 1. Your 6th round selection, 200th overall, you had Jaden Crumedy, an interior defensive lineman, specifically a nose tackle, out of Mississippi State. I had an undrafted free agent grade on him. And for those unaware, there is a tier above that called priority undrafted free agent. So he is the lowest grade that I can give to a player that I've scouted. And that is undrafted free agent grade. So the grade's a C because you decided to draft him. 7th round pick, 240 overall. You took the Michigan man, Mike Barrett, an off-ball linebacker, core special teams player year 1. That's likely going to be his role in the NFL pretty exclusively. Not sure if he's going to have much of a role beyond that at the next level. But moving back to the top here, pretty early on in the process, it became very clear that the Panthers really, really like Xaiver Legette. First things first, sorry for the typo, but I don't have time to go back and fix it if I'm going to get this video uploaded by 6. So it's got an extra E on the end. My bad. I was typing fast, not paying attention. Very early on in the process, it became pretty clear that Xaiver Legette was kind of the Panthers' guy. And I get it. I liked Xaiver Legette a lot. I was very high on him early on in the process, and I talked about that, where I was like, this guy's probably going to end up with a top 50, potentially top 40 grade for me. That's exactly where he ended up. But most people viewed him as like an end of a day 2 kind of guy until the scouting combine, and then he kind of blew that up and performed really, really, really well. And then everybody all of a sudden was right about where I was with him, where he's probably a back end of the 1st round, early 2nd round kind of guy, and that's basically where he went. But I was higher on him than most for a significant period of time throughout this draft process. And I really like the fit with this team. I think he is someone who is going to help Bryce Young because he is someone who gets separation, especially on crossing routes, because his agility and straight line speed is borderline elite. However, he's also someone who can get physical and win via physicality and going up and getting the pass in the air. I do have him graded as a Z, not an X, because I don't really think they're going to ask him to do that role, because Bryce Young at this point in his NFL career is still somebody that kind of needs to see the open receiver in order to get the ball to him on time. And I do really like overall that this class was very much about helping Bryce Young, specifically early on, because you also took Jonathan Brooks at 46. And I think Jonathan Brooks has the ability to be a legitimate Pro Bowl caliber running back day 1 in the NFL. He was graded, I think, as my running back 2 behind the kid out of Florida State whose name I'm blanking on right now. However, had he been healthy and been able to compete at the combine, there's a very real possibility he would have been my RB1. I really like Jonathan Brooks. He has upside as a pass catcher that was not particularly explored at Texas all that much. However, I do think he is going to be a productive NFL player day 1 for this team. I already kind of talked about Trevor Wallace. Don't really like that pick. Jadavian Sanders was phenomenal selection. They need a tight end. They need a guy that can get open over the middle. He can also end up playing like a big slot role for that team. And I really like the upside of that selection. He did not perform very well at the scouting combine. I think that kind of caused his slip down into early day 3 territory. However, I was not particularly expecting him to be an elite caliber athlete. So when he tested kind of like an average guy, I didn't really change my opinion on him, which was still a top 50 grade for me. And that's pretty much all that I got to say about this draft class in terms of individual players. If you want to see my overall grade for this draft class, you can either skip to the end of the video where I talk about the 4 draft classes as classes, or you can stick around through the next 2 teams, see the best picks portion of this video before getting into the draft class grades. New Orleans is up next, and with your first round selection, 14th overall, you guys are going to select Taliese Fuaga, an offensive tackle out of Oregon State. He was my offensive tackle too. I had a top 10 grade on him. This is a pick after value, so this is a B plus for me. I really like this. They desperately needed an offensive tackle, and it was a good class to need an offensive tackle because there was fucking 50 of them in my top 20. It was crazy, and I really like all of them. But ultimately, Fuaga was my number 2 offensive tackle, and you got him as not the second offensive tackle off the board, so that's good. In the second round, 41st overall, you also selected Kool-Aid McKinstry, a cornerback out of Alabama. Corners fell on day 1 and day 2 of this draft class. Kool-Aid McKinstry is a first-round talent, and you got him in the second round. I had a top 40 grade on him, so 41 is technically speaking after value, so the grade is a B+. You then did not have a 3rd or a 4th round selection. Instead, you had 3 5th round selections, thinking that that would make up for not having a 2nd and 3rd round selections. Anyway, Spenser Rattler at 150 is maybe, in terms of draft board and where I had all these players ranked, the biggest steal in the entire draft class, because I had a top 40 grade on Spenser Rattler. He was my QB5. I think this is someone who, given the opportunity and given the correct amount of support, could be a Pro Bowl caliber quarterback in the NFL. Needs to sit. He's not going to play this year unless Derek Carr gets hurt. But I think he is someone that could be your starting quarterback of the future, legitimately. Like, he's not someone that is like, oh, he's only talent like a Joe Milton. He's got production and he's got skill to his game. And he's a tad bit older than you'd like him to be. I think he's 23 and will turn 24 during the season. And he is still a little raw, so you'd like to think an older quarterback prospect would be a little bit more refined than the way that he actually is. But he sat for, I think, 2 years at Oklahoma before he started, or maybe it was just 1 year. But then he had to transfer to South Carolina, and that year was basically a wash except for the last 3 games of the year. Anyway, I do really like Spenser Rattler. Love this pick. One of the best picks of the entire draft, in my opinion. Bub Means, an ex-wide receiver out of Pittsburgh, had a 5th round grade on him. He took him in the 5th round. That grade is a B. 175th overall, you guys took Jalen Ford, an off-ball linebacker out of Texas. Big-time special teams upside, also has upside as a potential role player in a defensive scheme, but I did have a 6th round grade on him, so the grade is a B-. 699th overall, Christian Boyd, an interior defensive lineman out of Northern Iowa. A+ grade. I had a top 100 grade on Christian Boyd. We'll talk about that in a moment. Your last pick in the 7th round, 239th overall, was Josiah Aziram, an offensive tackle out of Eastern Kentucky. I did not have a grade on him, which is why that pick is not graded. However, going back to Christian Boyd, he was my, I think, nose tackle 4, maybe 3 in this entire class, and I had a top 100 grade on him. He's someone who day 1 is going to be a productive run stopper in the NFL. I don't really think that he's going to be any worse than that in his career. I think this is someone who's going to bounce around the league, worst case scenario, as a nose tackle that stops the run effectively. However, unlike a lot of nose tackles, specifically in this draft class, because I didn't have a whole lot of highly graded nose tackles, I think he has some upside as a pocket pusher along the interior of that line. probably not someone that you're going to want to get consistent pass rush reps. However, it's not the end of the world if he's caught out in pass rush land, so to speak. This is a guy that I think has a lot of upside and has the potential to be a starting caliber nose tackle in either a 3-4 or a 4-3. Very, 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 very good pick. Love that pick. Going back to Fuaga, however, we're going back to the top here. The news about Ramczyk is not great, obviously. I hope he gets better. I hope he can come back and play football again and is just as good as he was beforehand. But this pick, to me, likely signals that the team is either not expecting him to come back or is going to move on from him if he does decide to come back and play football again. Now, Fuaga, maybe the plan is you move him to left tackle. I'm not really sure if that is the plan. Go ahead and let me know if you know, and this is your team. That's good information to have. But I like him as a right tackle, and in today's NFL, I don't particularly think a left tackle is more valuable than a right tackle. That used to be the case because, generally speaking, you put your best edge rushers on the right side of your defense because they were very often right-handed. But nowadays, teams move those defensive linemen all around to try to get them the best matchups that they can. And I don't really like the idea, me personally, of asking offensive tackles to flip the side of the football. Not a big fan of that. I don't like doing it, and more often than not, it doesn't really work out. Penix is an exception to the rule, and that's like the only exception that I can think of right now. Now, being a swing tackle is a whole thing in the NFL, but generally speaking, those guys aren't starters. Because if they were good enough to play either left tackle or right tackle and start, they wouldn't be asked to be a swing tackle. Nevertheless, this is a good draft class overall. And if you want to see the overall grade, you can either skip to the end of this video or you can stick around through the final Tampa Bay section of this video and then move on to the best picks portion before we get into ranking the draft classes as classes. The final team here is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Starting with your first round selection, 26th overall, you guys selected Graham Barton, an interior offensive lineman out of Duke. I had a top 40 grade on him. You guys took him inside the top 40 and outside of the top 20. This is a pick at value. Your second round selection, 57th overall, was Chris Braswell, an edge out of Alabama. Gave that grade a B+ because I had a top 50 grade on him. Tyke Smith was your third round selection, or your first third round selection, rather, a slot defender out of Georgia. I had a 5th round grade on him, so that grade is a C as you took him inside the top 100. However, your other third round selection, Jalen McMillan, a slot wide receiver out of Washington, was very good. That gave that grade a B+, as I had a top 75 grade on Jalen McMillan. Really like him. I was a underrated player throughout this whole process. If he'd been healthy, I think he would have had a chance to go in the first round, if not earlier on day 2. Your 4th round selection, 125th overall, was Bucky Irving, a running back out of Oregon. And a little bit early for my taste, I had a 5th round grade on him, but it's not the end of the world. The grade is a B-. Your 6th round selection, 220th overall, was Elijah Klein, an interior offensive lineman out of UTEP, or the University of Texas, El Paso. And I had a 6th round grade on him, so the grade is a B. Your 7th round selection, 246th overall, was Devin Culp, a tight end out of Washington. And I had a priority undrafted free agent grade on him, not the end of the world, but I gave it a B- because it technically was a reach, in my opinion, to draft him. Moving back to the top with Graham Barton, I don't really have a whole lot to say about this draft class in general, but specifically with Barton probably playing center, likely a day 1 starter. I really do think he has a ton of upside at that position. He's gifted athletically, as well as being surprisingly technically sound. I also think he is someone who could legitimately play all 5 offensive line positions. Now, because of the size profile and stuff like that, left tackle would not be ideal to have him there, but in a pinch, he could get you out of a game if your starter or backup got hurt or something like that. Chris Broswell, I think, is going to end up starting as well. I really, really, really liked Chris Broswell. Almost a top 40 grade for me on him, so almost a first round-ish sort of guy for me. But overall, this is a draft class that really kind of hit for par almost. The one really big reach, in my opinion, with Tyke Smith, but even then, I do think he's going to be able to play and contribute relatively quickly. So I just don't necessarily like the upside there. I think he'll probably end up being like a below average to average slot corner in the NFL. Potentially actually moving him to safety is something that they could do. I don't know how much I like him there either, because I just had him graded as a slot. I don't know. He's very small for the position. Don't know about that pick. But outside of that, everything was pretty much a B or a B minus, B pluses, a couple of D pluses. But overall, this is kind of just like I hit for par. I'm right at 0 in golf terms. And solid draft class with some real contributors. Like I think your first 5 picks here are all going to contribute in year 1. So that's a good draft class, just a solid draft class. Before we get into grading the individual draft classes here, we're going to go through some of the best picks of these 4 teams. Spenser Rattler for the Saints, A+ pick, might be the best pick in the draft. Jatavian Sanders as well. Christian Boyd is also in that conversation just for best overall picks in the entire draft. Really, really good value for those 3 players there. Also, the Falcons, Atlanta, with 2 really nice picks after value in Brandon Dorless and Braylon Trice. And finally, Fuaga for the Saints, who I graded as a top 10 player. So getting him outside of the top 10 is really good value, in my opinion. So really like that pick for the Saints. However, the actual draft classes are ranked like this. I gave Atlanta a C+, just a ton of reaches, especially early on in the draft, where I do kind of weigh those selections more so than the later selections in the draft. Gave them a C+. Not a huge fan of what they did, and some of the picks that they made didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Tampa Bay ended up going with a B-. I just think that the Tyree pick is kind of weighing that class down a little bit. Likely, if you had selected somebody there, even maybe if they're just like a 4th round grade instead of a 5th round grade, probably end up at a B, very close to a B, but ended up going B-. Carolina is in 2nd place, gave them a B, kind of an average draft class by my estimations, but still added some really good talent, and I really like the thought process and philosophy behind their selections. But New Orleans was very clearly, in my opinion, the crown jewel of this division in terms of draft classes. Had 2 of the best picks of the entire draft, regardless of the team picking, and not just like in the division, but just 2 picks of the best in the entire draft. Really, really liked their draft selections here. Don't necessarily like the roster construction of the team overall, but I do really like their draft class, and their grade is an A-. And with that being said, that is all that I have for you today. So it's at this point I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with any point or you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.